what reassurance in those words of Jesus that we just read in John chapter 10. Verse 11, he says, I am the good shepherd, and the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Verse 12, when the hired hand sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. But I am the good shepherd. They say a good picture is worth 1,000 words. I think that we could just look at this picture and have a good sermon. The painter of this picture is an Indonesian brother. He's actually written more worship songs for the Indonesian churches than anyone else. But I want us to zero in on another of the claims that Jesus makes. John chapter 10, verse 9, he says, I am the gate. One place he says, I am the gate for the sheep. If you come in and go out, and that's a Hebrew expression for your whole daily life, you're going in, you're going out. If you do that through me, then you will find all that you need. The text says, you will find pasture, which for a sheep is what they need. And they will find very good pasture. Verse 10, you will have life and have it to the full. Through Jesus, we have access to the Father. And through Jesus, we also have access to the goodness that the Father designed for our life to enjoy. If we have our life revolve around Jesus, obeying him, following him, we will have life and have it abundantly, as the King James and the ESV word it, or have a rich and satisfying life, as the New Living Translation renders it. Is this the case? What Jesus claims? Yes. It definitely is the case. Jesus is not overstating. I delight in life that is centered around Jesus. And this morning, we're going to celebrate this by looking at human history. And we have a first-rate history teacher here this morning, so maybe they ought to be up here, but you all asked me to, and she's busy enough. But anyway, I wanted to have the fun. We could look at individual lives, recounting how Jesus changed them. Any change has to begin at an individual level. But that individual change, if it is true change, is going to make a difference in the lives around that individual, which will make a difference in that group's community, in that group's nation, and in our world. So let's look at this difference. What was the world like before Jesus came? We tend to lionize it, glorify it, or whatever, but as one historian, Tom Holland, said, he's one that wrote on the Greco-Roman Empire, wrote on the Persian Empire, and he grew up loving the Roman Empire, it was like, he said it was like young boys are fascinated by dinosaurs. They're these huge, terrifying creatures, but they're also extinct. So therefore, we love them. Well, that's how he felt about the Roman Empire. And then he realized that, no, he's different. His values are different. I want us to look at that. Interestingly, this is a comment that you, John, made in the adult Sunday school class that I was in, and that is, who is in control of this world? Well, 3 times in this gospel, John chapter 12, chapter 14, chapter 16, Jesus refers to Satan as the prince of this world, or the ruler of this world. John also in 1 John chapter 5 verse 19 says the whole world is under the control of the evil one. A world under the control of one who comes to steal, to kill, and destroy is not surprisingly full of senseless killing. Here's an excerpt from a Christianity Today online article. They have many articles in a magazine that comes out, and they have tons more. Throughout the 50s BC, Julius Caesar was Rome's leading military general, campaigning in Gaul, the area that's now France. His official aim was to subdue the territory for Rome, but he also felt like his career was sort of stagnating, that he needed a goodwill boost from the Roman public. So what could he do here in this campaign that might draw honor, accolades? And this was the days before social media, so, well, he could actually have his military exploits written out, and he could send them back to be published in Rome. Here's one episode from Caesar's Gallic Wars. His army comes across a large group of Germanic refugees who had been driven out of their former home by another tribe. 430,000 of them. And it seems clear from Caesar's description that these were not trained soldiers. These were unarmed families. To their surprise, Caesar orders a full-scale military attack. A massacre ensues as his soldiers pursue the defenseless men, women, and children on land and to a nearby river where some jump into the water in a vain attempt to escape. Caesar boasts happily that this battle resulted in not a single Roman casualty. Modern archaeological findings at the site confirm the gist of Caesar's account. They would often tend to, inflate the numbers, but archaeological findings, 150,000 civilians dead. Just senseless slaughter, just utter devaluing of non-Roman lives. And Caesar knew that it would make good PR for him. No one in Rome batted an eye. Instead, his popularity indeed did increase. Rome also had the Colosseum, where crowds would gather to watch gladiators fight to death. Killing was entertainment. And later they would watch Christians being mauled by the wild beasts. Violence, as in violent killing of actual persons, was accepted, even expected. So was slavery. Julius Caesar not only boasted of killing 1 million Gauls there in that France territory, but also of enslaving 1 million more. Slaves were everywhere in that day, in all cultures, all lands. It was taken for granted. And slaves had no rights. They had no value except as tools. Aristotle wrote, "A slave is a living tool, just as a tool is an inanimate slave." They could be mistreated on a whim. The bodies of used-up slaves were dumped on the trash heaps, exposed to scavenger birds and dogs. Killing, slavery, and no pity for the weak and the sick. We talked a little bit about this last week. Defective children could be discarded, thrown away. The word was exposed. Aristotle wrote, "Let there be a law that no deformed child shall be reared." We're better off without the weak. Our resources should be given to those who are superior, not to the inferior. There were no hospitals in that day except where there was economic value to having a hospital. So they had hospitals for soldiers because it paid to get them back on their feet, and for slaves because they were valuable as living tools. We recoil from such a world. And I had more examples, but that I cut out. I could go on. We are appalled that people could casually treat human beings this way because we believe in the dignity and value of every human being. We believe that people are not property, that each of us ought to have control over our own lives. We believe in the value of even the poor and the weak. In fact, we would say that a society can be judged by its treatment of its weakest members. How much do we care for and advocate for them? Where did we get those values? Obviously not from the Greco-Roman world. Many would answer that question, say, well, aren't those values sort of obvious? Even we hear the word self-evident in some of our founding documents. We have this sense that if we would think long enough, well, we as rational human beings will see those values. And the answer is often given that during what we call the Enlightenment, which is the 1700s and a bit before and a bit after, that's when a majority of humans saw them, and humanity was able to shake off the remnants of the Dark Ages and medieval ignorance and step into a life guided by reason and science. We, enlightened humans, finally figured it out through our great reasoning. We entered the age of enlightenment. Not at all. The change was because of the one who said, "I am the gate. Come in and go out through me, and you will have life to the full." The world got those values as more and more of the world came under the lordship of that one. Jesus taught his followers, love your neighbor as yourself. The value and care that you show for yourself, show to others. Love is the beating heart of the Christian ethic. In contrast, the classical Greek and Roman virtue lists barely mention love. Teachers like Plato or Cicero name things like wisdom and justice and courage and moderation. All traits well suited, as Glenn Scrivener says, to the army barracks. In fact, the word virtue comes from the Latin word vir, which means man. Virtue in that world was manliness. But Jesus revealed a different kind of man, teaching that the highest good was self-giving love, even to your enemies. And Jesus showed that love, even to those that his society did not value, as we saw some last Sunday. Even more, Jesus died for his friends and for his enemies. The Messiah, the King anointed by God, Messiah means anointed one, dies for all. Again and again in our text in John 10, Jesus talks about laying down his life, taking death upon himself voluntarily, even death on the cross, substituting his own life for others, showing the worth of all. And Jesus said, verse 16, I have other sheep. So we know that anyone that we meet can be one that Jesus laid down his life for. So we need to live like anyone we meet has value. And that death on the cross was the most shameful, most agonizing death ever. We get our word excruciating from crucifixion. It was reserved for the lowest, reserved for the most despised. But now, in the story of Jesus, we see astounded that God can make a victim the victor. Hold it. A lowly, despised victim has value? Tom Holland, in his book Dominion, which tells the story of the transformation that Jesus brought into the world, calls the cross the molten heart of the Christian story. It's not that those who follow Jesus, those who believe the Jesus story, instantly got all the implications of Jesus's teachings and of his death and changed their lives accordingly. For instance, with slavery, even after the empire became officially Christian in the year 380, slavery still continued in this Christian empire for hundreds of years. Why didn't Christians quickly turn from that evil? Well, just think about it. Christians are not just ones trying to follow Christ. We are also humans with our natural selfish impulses. And what's more, we are affected by the culture around us. When society around us can't even imagine something, it is very hard for us to think that Jesus calls us to do that. And no one in the Roman Empire could imagine the world functioning without slavery. That was just the way that things were. That was the way the world was structured. In the 400s, a Christian bishop called for the abolition of slavery. He was the first voice publicly recorded in the Roman Empire of this. Even his own congregation did not take him seriously. But the idea kept growing, and by the year 1000, slavery had pretty much vanished from Europe. And what helped people to imagine a world without slavery was baptism and the Lord's Supper being offered to everyone in the church, slaves included. And people realized, if Christ died for them, how can we say they don't have as much value as us? They are our brothers and our sisters. And then the next thought, however long it took, was, of course, our brothers and our sisters should not be enslaved. And so legislation came against slavery. Hospitals didn't take as long for the change to take place. Within a few years after Christians were no longer persecuted and they could legally build buildings, a group of church leaders passed a resolution that a hospice should be built near the site of every Christian church. And that was the year 325. These hospices were for homeless people, for sick people, and the like. But very soon, Christians were building places primarily for the sick. Within 40 years, the first hospitals were being built. What about all the killing? Change here came slower. Charlemagne, who was the king of the Franks, think France, Belgium, West Germany, that area, was the first Holy Roman Emperor. His path to power was a brutal one. For instance, toward the beginning of the 780s, he beheaded 4,500 Saxons in a single day. And as a brutal Christian emperor, he imposed basically what amounted to a policy of baptism or death. But we don't have to wait until the age of enlightenment before his behavior was called out. By the end of the 780s, Alcuin of York, the scholar, had changed the mind of Charlemagne, the warlord. Alcuin wrote, "A person can be drawn to the faith but not forced into it. We teach them. They choose." Charlemagne began a major educational push. Over 70 schools were established around Europe. But what about the Crusades? You know the story that many of you do. The Byzantine emperor of the Christian East pleaded for help from the church in the West against a Muslim foe that was about to wipe the entire Eastern Christian empire off the map. When one of the resulting crusades happened to succeed, most of them failed. It resulted in much killing and atrocity. But here's a perspective from Glenn Scrivener in his book, The Air We Breathe. If such battles were fought under the banner of an Alexander the Great, or a Julius Caesar, or even a Muhammad, what would we call them? Unexceptional, standard practice, business as usual. If we are outraged at the Crusades, and we should be, that is Christian outrage we're experiencing. See, crusader, if you think of that word, literally means one marked by the cross. They saw themselves taking up the cross. But on Jesus' lips, that meant to bear suffering, not to inflict suffering. More and more followers of Jesus began to imagine Jesus calling them to bear the cross the way that Jesus bore it. Interestingly, one was Francis of Assisi. He lived the end of the 1100s, the beginning of the 1200s. He actually traveled to the Crusaders' battlefield and tried to dissuade them from violence. He requested to be allowed to preach to the Sultan of Egypt. As he walked to the Sultan's tent, everyone thought he was walking to his death. But he lived, and his embrace of love and nonviolence at the risk of his life began to show what true cross-bearing looks like. Further, during this same time, again during the supposedly Dark Ages, Christian lawyers were busy taking understandings of their faith, like the obligation to help the poor, and codifying them as laws. And then after, for instance, it was a law that the wealthy have a responsibility to the poor, well, soon the reverse side of that, the implication of that, is that the poor have a claim on the wealthy. They have rights. It was during these centuries, deep in the middle of what we used to refer to as the Dark Ages, that Christian lawyers were busy developing the whole idea of human rights. As these lawyers were busy applying theological concepts to political realities, including the church jurist Francisco de Vitoria, who argued in the Spanish court that the Native Americans encountered in the New World had rights and dignity, and that many of the Spanish countrymen were treating them wrongly. Here's a statue of this church lawyer outside the United Nations building in New York City in a garden. The inscription in Spanish says, "Founder of the Right of Nations." In English, we probably say, "Founder of International Law." De Vitoria died in the first half of the 1500s, well before any age of enlightenment. Rather than human reason bringing into our world the ideas of human rights, the idea of the dignity of all and our responsibility to care for those without power, it came into the world through people affected by Jesus, the Good Shepherd, who laid down his life for all. Glenn Scrivener again. The key sentence from the Declaration of Independence can only be said with integrity if all the emphasis is put on the first word. We hold these truths to be self-evident. And the we are individuals who were formed in a culture formed by individuals who had Jesus's words and example guiding their coming in and their going out, receiving the goodness of life as it is designed to be lived, and slowly changing their world too. And we still have a ways to go. But hallelujah, the good that is in the world can be traced to Christ. And of course, I'm a preacher, so I should be saying that, but I can give you the names of many historians and thinkers who are atheist or agnostic who say that same thing. So that's another reason why I delight to follow Jesus and delight to help others to do so too. Because Jesus is the one who has changed our world like no one else.